Hey everybody, Mr. Wallowitz here. Hope everyone is doing well. I want to get into notes about when the Europeans meet the Native Americans. Here we go. A couple of vocabulary terms here. We have cultural imperialism, which is one group of people telling another that their culture was wrong and the new invading culture is right. Syncretism, combining different religions, cultures, or schools of thought. And cognitive dissonance, the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially as relating to behavioral decisions and attitude change. These are very high level vocabulary terms that you do need to know for any tests that will come up. Let's move on. Who are the Pilgrims? Pilgrims were a religious group called Puritans who left England and moved to Holland to escape religious persecution and eventually made it to America by 1620. The Puritans they wanted to purify the corruption and hierarchy of the Church of England. The Church of England was the official church in England to which everyone automatically belonged. So Puritans were this group of people within the Church of England. And in the Church of England, the main religion is Protestantism. They wanted to purify the Church of England. They wanted to call for transparency, where all of the wrongs that were going on, they should have been viewed for everyone to see. So they started to take a little bit more different approach to practicing their religion in the hopes that other people would follow so that the Church of England could change. Puritans believed that the final authority came from the Bible and not from church officials, and therefore every individual had direct access to the Word of God. Some Puritans wanted to completely separate from the Church of England. They were called separatists. And the group of Puritans who came on the Mayflower in 1620 were separatists. So the Puritans believed that everybody should have access to the Bible, everybody should be able to read it, and that the church officials should not be the only ones to determine who is good and who is bad. Everybody has a chance to be good. It's choices that are made, and everybody should live that way based on their own interpretation of the Bible, not necessarily what church officials want you to believe. When the Mayflower comes over to what is eventually going to be Massachusetts, Plymouth Rock, when it lands on Plymouth Rock, the Mayflower is filled of Puritans who wanted to separate from the Church of England. They are separatists. Now, we're going to go back in time a little bit now. Early humans in America. Disease and viruses have been on Earth and with humans ever since the formation of the planet. Early humans started migrating to North America. Diseases couldn't survive. Some diseases, when the Native Americans were coming over from Asia and crossing the Bering Strait during one of the last ice ages, the Bering Strait had been exposed. The water had disappeared, so there was a land bridge there. So the early humans would come from Asia, cross over that land bridge, and into present-day Alaska, and eventually would work their way and populate the entirety of North and South America. Because it was so cold, a lot of the diseases that had been around with the humans ever since their evolution in Africa and spread through to Europe and Asia wasn't able to survive. So it was kind of like they were being filtered through into North America. So a lot of the diseases that had been with humans were being lost with every new generation. The absence of livestock in North America also helps the natives stay healthy. Livestock like cows and pigs and such carry diseases. And if there aren't any in North America, and there weren't, that was introduced by the Europeans later on, disease can't, there is no disease for them there, and the natives are still very healthy. All this starts to change after the arrival of the Spanish in the late 15th century with the introduction of European disease, as well as livestock. So here we have a rough map of human migration over time. We see here that the first apes start to walk on 2 feet, become Homo erectus. They originate in the Serengeti region of Africa, and eventually, after generation and generation, more and more two-legged or walking apes, the Homo erectus, become more and more. They start to mate, and after generations, there are a lot of them, and they start to wander, possibly to chase food, maybe to get just to branch out and see the rest of the world. But they will eventually migrate into Asia, into Europe, and populate those continents, eventually getting to Australia, the Southeast Asia, and eventually into the Americas, into North and South America. Disease spreads across the continent. By the time the Puritans arrived in 1620, smallpox had started to kill the natives. So Columbus and the Spanish get here. They are introducing these new diseases, especially as we discussed with the Truth About Columbus handout. Smallpox and the plague are going to kill the natives, and it's going to destroy them even more so than any of the violence and terror committed by Columbus and his men. So when the Spanish and the other Europeans start coming to Native American territories, disease is going to kill them. Smallpox could be contracted by one group of Indians, and it would destroy their communities. Those who had been infected but may not be showing symptoms or survive would abandon their territory and join up with other Native American tribes. And in doing so, those who were asymptomatic would infect the new tribe. When the Pilgrims arrived, only a fraction of the Indians who had lived in New England, in the Massachusetts area, were left. So what would happen is the Native Americans would be infected. Many would die. Their villages would be ravaged by disease. So they would get up, and those who were healthy enough would get up and leave, join up with new tribes, but then unknowingly infect those new tribes. And it would be a domino effect from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. So in only 128 years, smallpox, as well as other European diseases, kills upwards of 96% of the Native American population in North America. Because of these diseases, the English were able to take Indian land without much of a fight. So there isn't much resistance, especially when the Puritans arrive at Plymouth in Massachusetts. The natives don't really give them much of a fight because they have already been weakened by diseases that were put forth here by Columbus and his men in 1492 and up to 1506. So here we are now in 1620, and the native populations are starting to become smaller and smaller, weaker and weaker because of smallpox, the plague, and other diseases. If disease hadn't affected the Native Americans, colonization would have been much slower. If the Native Americans had a resistance to any of these European diseases, or at least some sort of immunity that the body knew how to fight, you could make the argument that colonization would have been much slower. The natives outnumbered the Europeans by large numbers. So just the presence in numbers would overwhelm the Europeans. And could the Europeans have overwhelmed them with their technology, their military technology? Probably, but colonization would definitely have been much, much slower. So European influence on Native Americans. Then we're going to get into how Europeans started to influence Native Americans and how they started to live their lives based on what the Europeans believed in, because the Europeans thought the Native American way of life was different. It was wrong. Indians influenced Europeans first. So Native Americans had taught the Europeans what to grow and how to grow it. Native Americans had relied on working the fields and hunting for food. Europeans introduced the Native Americans to the fur trade, and Europeans introduced guns and the latest military technology to the Native Americans. So there was a bit of an exchange here. The Native Americans knew what to grow and how to grow it. So in exchange for maybe some weaponry, they showed the Europeans how to grow, or what to grow and how to grow it. The Native Americans relied on the lands, working the land and hunting for food. So the Europeans are going to introduce weapons to help hunt. They're going to introduce the fur trade to maybe not grow so much anymore, but hey, if you go and trade with other tribes, you can get these crops. You don't really have to grow anything anymore. So the Native Americans are showing the Europeans what to do, while at the same time, the Europeans are trying to make life a little bit easier for the Native Americans. Europeans established old systems in North America. The Native Americans had gone to war with rival tribes in the past, but it was hardly ever about taking land. There would be disputes, and they would fight it out, but at the end, it was the land belongs to everybody. We're not trying to take anybody's land. Our dispute is over. Let's just go on about our lives. European, it was all about conquering land, killing as many people as possible to overwhelm your enemy. When Europeans introduced guns to the Native Americans, all of this changes. Europeans would sell arms to Native Americans, and they would develop a sense of superiority over the tribes who did not have guns. And so from there, Native American warfare became much more about domination rather than a settlement of disputes. With this newfound sense of power that the Native Americans have, with having European military technology, it became less about just a settlement of disputes and more about, I'm more powerful than you, so I'm going to take you over. It is that system of empire type of thinking that the Europeans have, that they introduced to the Native Americans, so that I guess the Europeans could feel more at home. Or to say, the way that you do things, the way that you share things, the way that you share your crops, the animals that you're going to eat and so on, that's weird to us. Here's how we do it. This is much better. Native Americans and slavery. Europeans quickly found out how difficult it was to enslave the Native Americans and started bringing Africans as slave labor. With this new sense of dominance that the Native Americans were feeling, they started to use Africans as a slave labor source to tend to their lands. With the fur trade and the slave trade, it became easier for the Native Americans to trade for food rather than grow it themselves. Europeans thus killed the agriculture system the Native Americans had been using for thousands of years. So with the introduction of slave labor and having other people do the work for you, with the fur trade, and it's easier to trade for food than it would be to grow it. The Europeans are systematically destroying Native American tradition, custom, and culture. Finally, it comes full circle. Since the Europeans learned what to grow and how to grow it, they became less dependent on the Native Americans. The Native Americans relied on Europeans for food and became more dependent on the Europeans. So since the Native Americans had taught the early Europeans what to grow and how to grow it, they were doing that without Native American help now. So they're establishing, they're putting their foothold in North and South America, saying, thank you for teaching us what to do. We don't need you anymore. Native Americans, on the other hand, were starting to become more and more dependent on the Europeans for food, because now the Europeans were the ones growing the food, and for trade. So in the end, Native Americans were being enslaved, killed, and Native American technology was lost, not the Europeans. In the end here, the European way of life is the one that endures, and the Native American life is the one that is manipulated to be taught in a certain way to generation after generation after generation of students, people all across the United States. Thank you for watching. Hope you learned something. See you later.